Chapter 3 of A Smile of Fortune by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. A Smile of Fortune, Chapter 3. Jacobus having put me in mind of his wealthy brother, I concluded I would pay that business call at once. I had by that time heard a little more of him. He was a member of the council, where he made himself objectionable to the authorities. He exercised a considerable influence on public opinion. Lots of people owed him money. He was an importer on a great scale of all sorts of goods. For instance, the whole supply of bags for sugar was practically in his hands. This last fact I did not learn till afterwards. The general impression conveyed to me was that of a local personage. He was a bachelor, and gave weekly card parties in his house out of town, which were attended by the best people in the colony. The greater, then, was my surprise to discover his office in shabby surroundings, quite away from the business quarter, amongst a lot of hovels. Guided by a black board with white lettering, I climbed a narrow wooden staircase and entered a room with a bare floor of planks littered with bits of brown paper and wisps of packing straw. A great number of what looked like wine cases were piled up against one of the walls. A lanky, inky, light yellow mulatto youth, miserably long-necked and generally recalling a sick chicken, got off a three-legged stool behind a cheap deal desk and faced me as if gone dumb with fright. I had some difficulty in persuading him to take in my name, though I could not get from him the nature of his objection. He did it at last with an almost agonized reluctance, which ceased to be mysterious to me when I heard him being sworn at menacingly with savage suppressed growls, then audibly cuffed and finally kicked out without any concealment whatever, because he came back flying head foremost through the door with a stifled shriek. To say I was startled would not express it. I remained still like a man lost in a dream. Clapping both his hands to that part of his frail anatomy which had received the shock, the poor wretch said to me simply, "Will you go in, please?" His lamentable self-possession was wonderful, but it did not do away with the incredibility of the experience. A preposterous notion that I had seen this boy somewhere before, a thing obviously impossible, was like a delicate finishing touch of weirdness added to a scene fit to raise doubts as to one's sanity. I stared anxiously about me like an awakened somnambulist. "I say," I cried loudly, "there isn't a mistake, is there? This is Mr. Jacobus's office." The boy gazed at me with a pained expression, and somehow so familiar. A voice within growled offensively, come in, since you are there. I didn't know." I crossed the outer room as one approaches the den of some unknown wild beast, with intrepidity, but in some excitement. Only no wild beast that ever lived would rouse one's indignation. The power to do that belongs to the odiousness of the human brute. And I was very indignant, which did not prevent me from being at once struck by the extraordinary resemblance of the two brothers. This one was dark instead of being fair like the other, but he was as big. He was without his coat and waistcoat. He had been doubtless snoozing in the rocking-chair which stood in a corner furthest from the window. Above the great bulk of his crumpled white shirt, buttoned with 3 diamond studs, his round face looked swarthy. It was moist. His brown moustache hung limp and ragged. He pushed a common cane-bottomed chair towards me with his foot. "Sit down." I glanced at it casually. Then, turning my indignant eyes full upon him, I declared in precise and incisive tones that I had called in obedience to my owner's instructions. "Oh, yes, I didn't understand what that fool was saying. But never mind, it will teach the scoundrel to disturb me at this time of the day," he added, grinning at me with savage cynicism. I looked at my watch. It was past 3 o'clock, quite the full swing of afternoon office work in the port. He snarled imperiously, "Sit down, Captain." I acknowledged the gracious invitation by saying deliberately, "I can listen to all you may have to say without sitting down." Emitting a loud and vehement "Pshaw!" he glared for a moment, very round-eyed and fierce. It was like a gigantic tomcat spitting at one suddenly. Look at him. What do you fancy yourself to be? What did you come here for? If you won't sit down and talk business, you had better go to the devil. "I don't know him personally," I said, "but after this I wouldn't mind calling on him. It would be refreshing to meet a gentleman." He followed me, growling behind my back. "The impudence! I've a good mind to write to your owners what I think of you." I turned on him for a moment. "As it happens, I don't care. For my part, I assure you I won't even take the trouble to mention you to them." He stopped at the door to his office while I traversed the littered ante-room. I think he was somewhat taken aback. "I will break every bone in your body," he roared suddenly at the miserable mulatto lad, "if you ever dare to disturb me before 3:30 for anybody. Do you hear? For anybody. Let alone for any damned skipper," he added in a lower growl. The frail youngster, swaying like a reed, made a low moaning sound. I stopped short and addressed this sufferer with advice. It was prompted by the sight of a hammer, used for opening the wine cases, I suppose, which was lying on the floor. "If I were you, my boy, I would have that thing up my sleeve when I went in next, and at the first occasion I would—" What was there so familiar in that lad's yellow face? Entrenched and quaking behind the flimsy desk, he never looked up. His heavy, lowered eyelids gave me suddenly the clue to the puzzle. He resembled, yes, those thick glued lips, he resembled the brothers Jacobus. He resembled both, the wealthy merchant and the pushing shopkeeper, who resembled each other. He resembled them as much as a thin, light yellow mulatto lad may resemble a big, stout, middle-aged white man. It was the exotic complexion and the slightness of his build which had put me off so completely. Now I saw in him unmistakably the Jacobus strain, weakened, attenuated, diluted, as it were, in a bucket of water, and I refrained from finishing my speech. I had intended to say, "Crack this brute's head for him." I still felt the conclusion to be sound, but it is no trifling responsibility to counsel parricide to anyone, however deeply injured. Beggarly, cheeky skippers! I despised the emphatic growl at my back. Only being much vexed and upset, I regret to say that I slammed the door behind me in a most undignified manner. It may not appear altogether absurd if I say that I brought out from that interview a kindlier view of the other Jacobus. It was with a feeling resembled partisanship that, a few days later, I called at his store. That long, cavern-like place of business, very dim at the back and stuffed full of all sorts of goods, was entered from the street by a lofty archway. At the far end I saw my Jacobus exerting himself in his shirt-sleeves among his assistants. The captain's room was a small vaulted apartment with a stone floor and heavy iron bars in its windows, like a dungeon converted to hospitable purposes. A couple of cheerful bottles and several gleaming glasses made a brilliant cluster round a tall, cool, red earthenware pitcher on the centre table, which was littered with newspapers from all parts of the world. A well-groomed stranger in a smart grey check suit, sitting with one leg flung over his knee, put down one of these sheets briskly and nodded to me. I guessed him to be a steamer captain. It was impossible to get to know these men. They came and went too quickly, and their ships lay moored far out, at the very entrance of the harbour. Theirs was another life altogether. He yawned slightly. "Dull hole, isn't it?" I understood this to allude to the town. "Do you find it so?" I murmured. "Don't you? But I'm off tomorrow, thank goodness." He was a very gentlemanly person, good-natured and superior. I watched him draw the open box of cigars to his side of the table, take a big cigar case out of his pocket, and begin to fill it very methodically. Presently, on our eyes meeting, he winked like a common mortal and invited me to follow his example. "They are really decent smokes." I shook my head. "I'm not off tomorrow." "What of that? Think I'm abusing old Jacobus's hospitality? Heavens, it goes into the bill, of course. He spread such little matters all over his account. He can take care of himself. Why, it's business." I noted a shadow fall over his well-satisfied expression, a momentary hesitation in closing his cigar case. But he ended by putting it in his pocket jauntily. A placid voice uttered in the doorway, "That's quite correct, Captain." The large, noiseless Jacobus advanced into the room. His quietness in the circumstances amounted to cordiality. He had put on his jacket before joining us, and he sat down in the chair vacated by the steamer man, who nodded again to me and went out with a short, jarring laugh. A profound silence reigned. With his drowsy stare, Jacobus seemed to be slumbering open-eyed. Yet somehow I was aware of being profoundly scrutinized by those heavy eyes. In the enormous cavern of the store, somebody began to nail down a case expertly. Tap, 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 tap. Two other experts, one slow and nasal, the other sharp and snappy, started checking an invoice. A half-coil of 3-inch manila rope. Right. 6 assorted shackles. Right. 6 tins assorted soups, 3 of pate, 2 asparagus, 14 pounds tobacco. Cabin. Right. It's for the captain who was here just now, breathed out the immovable Jacobus. These steamer orders are very small. They pick up what they want as they go along. That man will be in Samarang in less than a fortnight. Very small orders indeed. The calling over of the items went on in the shop. An extraordinary jumble of varied articles. Paintbrushes, Yorkshire relish, etc., etc. 3 sacks of best potatoes, read out the nasal voice. At this, Jacobus blinked like a sleeping man roused by a shake, and displayed some animation. At his order, shouted into the shop, a smirking half-caste clerk with his ringlets much oiled and with a pen stuck behind his ear, brought in a sample of 6 potatoes, which he paraded in a row on the table. Being urged to look at their beauty, I gave them a cold and hostile glance. Calmly, Jacobus proposed that I should order 10 or 15 tons. Tons! I couldn't believe my ears. My crew could not have eaten such a lot in a year, and potatoes, excuse these practical remarks, are a highly perishable commodity. I thought he was joking, or else trying to find out whether I was an unutterable idiot. But his purpose was not so simple. I discovered that he meant me to buy them on my own account. I am proposing you a bit of business, Captain. I wouldn't charge you a great price. I told him that I did not go in for trade. I even added grimly that I knew only too well how that sort of spec generally ended. He sighed and clasped his hands on his stomach with exemplary resignation. I admired the placidity of his impudence. Then, waking up somewhat, "Won't you try a cigar, Captain?" "No thanks, I don't smoke cigars." "For once," he exclaimed in a patient whisper. A melancholy silence ensued. You know how sometimes a person discloses a certain unsuspected depth and acuteness of thought, that is, in other words, utters something unexpected. It was unexpected enough to hear Jacobus say, "The man who just went out was right enough. You might take one, Captain. Here everything is bound to be in the way of business." I felt a little ashamed of myself. The remembrance of his horrid brother made him appear quite a decent sort of fellow. It was with some compunction that I said a few words to the effect that I could have no possible objection to his hospitality. Before I was a minute older, I saw where this admission was leading me. As if changing the subject, Jacobus mentioned that his private house was about 10 minutes' walk away. It had a beautiful old walled garden, something really remarkable. I ought to come round some day and have a look at it. He seemed to be a lover of gardens. I too take extreme delight in them, but I did not mean my compunction to carry me as far as Jacobus's flower beds, however beautiful and old. He added, with a certain homeliness of tone, "There's only my girl there." It is difficult to set everything down in due order, so I must revert here to what happened a week or 2 before. The medical officer of the port had come on board my ship to have a look at one of my crew who was ailing, and naturally enough he asked to step into the cabin. A fellow shipmaster of mine was there too, and in the conversation, somehow or other, the name of Jacobus came to be mentioned. It was pronounced with no particular reverence by the other man, I believe. I don't remember now what I was going to say. The doctor, a pleasant, cultivated fellow with an assured manner, prevented me by striking in a sour tone. "Ah, you're talking about my respected papa-in-law." Of course, that sally silenced us at the time, but I remembered the episode, and at this juncture, pushed for something non-committal to say, I inquired with polite surprise, "You have your married daughter living with you, Mr. Jacobus?" He moved his big hand from right to left quietly. "No, that was another of his girls," he stated, ponderously and under his breath as usual. He seemed in a pause to be ransacking his mind for some kind of descriptive phrase. But my hopes were disappointed. He merely produced his stereotyped definition. "She is a very different sort of person." "Indeed. And by the by, Jacobus, I called on your brother the other day. It's no great compliment if I say that I found him a very different sort of person from you." He had an air of profound reflection, then remarked quaintly, "He's a man of regular habits." He might have been alluding to the habit of late siesta, but I mumbled something about beastly habits anyhow, and left the store abruptly. End of chapter 3.
Thank you for listening to this chapter. If you'd like to keep following this story or discover more fascinating tales, be sure to subscribe to our channel and enable notifications. We look forward to sharing the next exciting chapter with you. Until next time.